My first question, of course, would be, Peter, what means deconstruction to you?
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. I hope I'm not here under false pretenses. I could deconstruct this whole evening by actually saying that I never used the term deconstruction, have never written it, lectured about it, or proposed that what I do has anything to do with deconstruction. However, since that it would only be 80% true, I will try and elaborate, because that's begging off. I will say that Jacques was very important to me, and I will try and, through 3 or 4 points, answer Peter's question about architecture and Jacques' influence on architecture and deconstruction. Number one, Jacques used to say, architecture is the locus of the metaphysics of presence. And since one of Jacques' projects was the attempt to open up the problematic of metaphysics, and particularly the problematic of presence, he said that the reason he was interested in architecture and spent so much time on architecture was that it was so resistant to the project of deconstruction. And I thought for a long time that that was probably true, which is, for me, the problematic of the metaphysical project, that while architecture has undertaken to clear away all of the detritus of the classical, the rule systems, the aesthetics, the social systems, the hierarchical systems that contaminated architecture, let's say, for 500 years, which was instantiated by the Renaissance to overcome the transcendental problem, to create an immanent metaphysic. It is precisely that immanent metaphysic that is not able to be eradicated up until the present time. So for me, it remains a central problematic. One of the ways that I have tried to manifest a critique of the notion of architecture as a manifestation of presence is through the relationship of the subject, the human subject, to the object architecture. And what I've tried to do in the past, in the traditional architecture, meaning and experience were part of the same thing. That is, a person walks through a building and sees a set of columns on the right side, walks, turns around, sees a set of columns on the left, and knows that it's a symmetrical building, that it's an axial building, etc., by the symmetry of right and left. So it's the experience of the project. And what we have tried to do in our work is, in fact, to suggest that the experience of the object that is the presence in the experience, does not give you an understanding of the object. And this was very important in our work, especially in our Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, because what we said is, you can walk around this project and you don't learn anything at all. You don't know anything, you don't go anywhere. Anywhere is no different than some other anywhere. And the whole idea of the project was, in fact, to reduce the meaning of experience, because I believe that's precisely what happened in the camps, the reduction of the meaning of experience, that you cannot explain in any meaningful way what the camps were intended for. And so our memorial is, in a sense, an analogy to the experience of the camps, but also an analogy to the idea of breaking down the relationship between experience and understanding. The second integer that was really important for me from conversations with Jacques was the question of the possibility of the free-floating signifier as a tenet of discourse. And as we know, all architecture since Alberti, who wrote 10 books on architecture as a critique of a man called Vitruvius, who in Roman times had written 10 books on architecture, setting out the rules of discourse of the discipline. And Alberti made a critique of these rules 14 centuries later, and his major critique had to do with the Vitruvian triad: commodity, firmness, and delight. And firmness, firmitas, was about something being solid, and you needed to have something which stood up. And of course, Vitruvius didn't mean, according to Alberti, that architecture should stand up, because all architecture stands up, or it isn't architecture. It shelters, encloses, etc. He said what Vitruvius meant by firmitas was not only should architecture stand up, but it should look like it stands up. And the look like, in other words, was the signifier in the signified. And from that point on in the humanist project, the whole notion of looking like became very important. And of course, to detach this introduction of what became known as an immanent metaphysic, to detach the signifier from the sign, that is, to detach the meaning from the column, so that the column merely was a thing, and that there was no necessary analogous significance, like to a tree, to a human being, to any kind of vertical, upright something. And so that was his second thing, that is that, and there are many ways to try and detach this, to double up a structural system where you know there's an excess or redundancy. And so if you look and you have two columns where you only need one, then you ask the question, well, what's the second column doing? Well, the second column is either operating half the time as a column, both operating half the time, or none of the time of the column. And if it's not acting not as a structure none of the time, what's it doing? And so the whole idea of the free-floating signifiers was another lesson learned from my misreading, let's say, of the Derridian thought. That this whole question of origin and truth in architecture, that a lot of people feel, especially preservationists, that, oh my goodness, this is here, this particular configuration of Washington Mews, we shouldn't tear it down because it's here, it's been here forever, and it's a good thing. And of course, the people, for example, who argued against Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim in 1956 and 57, as I well remember, were saying, oh my God, it's ruining the neighborhood. We can't have this sort of thing on Fifth Avenue, put it in the park. It's just a toy, and it's not like the rest of the buildings in this neighborhood. And the same people, 50 years later or 40 years later, 30, 40 years later, when Charles Gwathmey was doing an addition to the Guggenheim, the same people protested and said, you mustn't touch this Guggenheim. It's sacred, and we can't do this. And so these voices of the fact that something which is there previously or first has some more validity than anything else. And so the whole notion of the denial of the transcendental signified, that is one thing beyond all other things, one thing that was first, that was more truthful, more valid, more original than anything else. And so Jacques was another person that suggested that this was also a problematic constraint. The last thing that I wanted to say about the Derridian influence is, for me, architecture, it does not mean that things have to be built necessarily. Architecture are ideas that are formed by space and time. As long as those ideas exist in some way, then that's architecture. Many of the best architects from the end of the last century never built very much. Cedric Price is a name, John Haydock, who was the dean at Cooper Union. But I could go back to Piranesi, who was one of the great architects, I think, of all times. He did etchings, and he built one building. Borromini, one of the most famous architects of all time, built 5 buildings. So to me, you don't have to build many buildings to be an architect. What you have to have are many ideas. And that brings one to the concept of writing, because I believe that architecture, in its most important condition, is a writing. And if we look at the history of architecture, that is what has come down to us as great building. We realize that the great architects wrote treatises, and without those treatises, we would rarely have looked at their buildings. And I start with Palladio's Quattro Libri, the 4 books, which were written at the end of his life, where he redrew all the buildings that he built the way he wanted them to be remembered, not the way they were built. Le Corbusier wrote a book called Vers une architecture, Towards an Architecture. He wrote the 5 points toward a new architecture. He drew the 4 compositions. He was the man that articulated the paradigm for architecture. And yet there were a lot of Frenchmen designing little white houses like Le Corbusier who never wrote a thing, and they're totally unimportant. Because this man produced a discourse about architecture. The same can be said for Robert Venturi, Aldo Rossi, Rem Koolhaas. No? No. So for me, the writing is more important in a sense than the building. Now, to make a caveat about that as I close, Manfredo Tafuri, one of the most important critics of the last century, said to me, you know, Peter, you can write all you want. If you hadn't built, none of us as critics would have been interested in what you do. So there is a limit to the discourse. You always have to build, and you always have to think, and you always have to put those thoughts down, whether in writing or building. You cannot be merely a paper architect. And I think that the difference between writing and building, and the reason why you have to build, one as an architect has to build, the difference between the two is that writing, the narrative form of writing, allows for the time of interpretation, the time of understanding, the consideration, the reflection, the spirit of what is being said. Whereas the experience of building is, in a sense, a one-time thing. And I wrote a paper at a conference here at NYU some 20 years ago called The Being Only Once of Architecture. And architecture is an only once thing, the actual experience of the building.